Let's talk about strategy, but let's keep things really simple so you can apply these principles that we're going to talk about in today's episode in your business to drive more value. There are 4 fundamentals to understand as it pertains to strategy. Let's start with number 1. Strategy and strategic planning, they're 2 totally different things. I don't know what happened, but somewhere along the way, somebody took the term planning and they combined it with strategy. I don't know if they were trying to make it sound more sexy or more appealing or whatever they're trying to do. And they said, look, this is strategy, strategic planning. They're not the same thing. Okay, so when it comes to strategic planning, that's how you execute your strategy. So you have to come up with a strategy first in order to have a plan to go execute on that strategy. And that's where leaders oftentimes go astray. They'll hire somebody, they'll come out, they'll do an offsite, they'll get the whole team together, and during that offsite meeting, they'll just determine the plans for the company. And oftentimes, planning involves taking action or trying to optimize parts of the business. But my question always is, how do you know what the heck to optimize or what to focus on if you don't have a strategy? So fundamental number 1 is understanding that strategy is an interrelated set of choices that we make pertaining to where we're going to compete, how we're going to compete, and ultimately how we will win in business. So when I go into organizations, I help them to put in place a strategy blueprint. There are several components. I'll walk you through them really quickly. Number 1, you have to start with your purpose. Why does the business exist? It's very basic, very fundamental, but you have to get this right because this is what's going to inspire the rest of the strategy. Number 2, you have to define what are your principles. Now, you may have values in your business, and that's fine. I just think that principles are better because principles are your values in action. So after you define your purpose and your principles, you're ready to move on to uncovering your strategic problem. Now, don't skip over this part. And don't try to change the terminology. I was working with an owner once. He said, Steve, problem just sounds so negative. Can we just call it like the strategic opportunity? I said, no. In this stage, we want to uncover what is the biggest obstacle that the company is facing that if they don't overcome this, they're going to run into some serious troubles down the road. And so when you focus on defining your strategic problem and you get really clear about what it is and what are the implications if you don't overcome it, then you'll be ready for the next step, which involves exploring your strategic options. When you're evaluating your strategic options, you're looking at 4 different quadrants and you're iterating in these different boxes. Number 1, you're going to define your shared aspiration. In other words, what does winning look like? Number 2, you're going to look at your market focus and position within the strategic option. And then you're going to look at number 3, your competitive behavior, whether you're going to pursue a differentiation strategy or a cost leadership strategy or a focus strategy, some combination thereof. And then lastly, you have to evaluate your resources and returns. That's the 4th box in this quadrant. Those 4 boxes make up your strategic options. So you iterate over and over again. At the center of this quadrant is the customer. And oftentimes organizations, they leave out the customer. Right? They build these grand strategies, and then I look at it, I'm like, where the heck's the customer? You haven't even identified your ideal customer profile. You have to start with that. So then you have your strategic options identified. Maybe you have 1, 2, 3, or 5. But then you have to consider which of these options is desirable, practical, and economical. And the economical piece includes building out a forecast or modeling the value of the business as is compared to the optimized value, and then deciding whether or not the returns are worth all the effort and all the risk based on the strategic option. Once you've identified that, you're then ready to combine all this together and create a strategic statement. You're then ready to move on to the strategic statement. This is when you have a short, concise statement that you can communicate to all levels of the organization regarding what your strategy actually is. Okay, so you have your strategic statement, you're good to go. You put in place KPIs to measure the operational and financial performance of the business based on the strategy you have in place. These indicators will be your report card as you go out there and execute. And then you put in place a plan to execute. And that's when IARs come into place. That's the framework that I've been using for years to turn around and grow companies. And it stands for initiatives, actions, and results. So that's the strategy blueprint. as you can see here, there's a difference between the strategy phase, where you're defining your purpose, your principles, the strategic problem. You're going through the quadrants to evaluate your options, and then you define your strategic statement, and then you identify KPIs. That's all the part of your strategy. Then you get into the execution, which is the plan, which involves initiatives, actions, and results. So that's fundamental number one. There's a major difference between strategy and strategic planning. And just remember, strategy is an interrelated set of choices that you make regarding where you'll compete, and how you will win. All right, fundamental number two is defining your strategic problem. Now, I touched on this in fundamental number one when I talked about the strategy blueprint, but I need to emphasize this because you have to get your strategic problem right. Because if you identify the wrong problem, guess what's going to follow? You're going to have the wrong strategy. You're going to be pursuing initiatives that don't even relate back to your strategic problem. So to get your strategic problem right, you have to ask the tough questions, right? You have to punch yourself in the gut and get real, right? Sometimes you have to get customer feedback that stings. In other words, you may have to ask your customers, what do you hate about doing business with us, right? Ask the tough questions. You have to benchmark your financial performance. You have to identify what are the drivers in your value logic tree. All these things combined together to help you to identify, okay, where is the friction in the system? Where's the breakdown in the operating model? And what can we do to improve things? So getting your strategic problem right, I can't emphasize that enough, is so critical. I'm telling you, if you don't get this right, you're going to waste a lot of time going down a bunch of different paths. This is the one singular problem you must overcome in order to fulfill your purpose and to achieve your desired state, right? Your winning aspiration. And then fundamental number three includes crafting the right initiatives, all right? Now, initiatives do four things. This is really important to understand. Number one, initiatives help you to overcome your strategic problem. Number two, they help you to enhance your customer experience. Number three, they foster innovation. And number four, they help you to build competitive advantages. Now, I've put in place a ton of initiatives in my own company and companies that I've worked with or companies that I've turned around. And I can tell you that if an initiative doesn't touch on one of those four items, it's probably not a good initiative. So you just have to ask yourself, okay, is this helping us to overcome our strategic problem? Is it enhancing the customer experience? Is it allowing us to innovate? Is it creating competitive advantages that we can leverage in order to drive greater firm value? And if the answer is no, then you may have to rethink your initiative. Also, remember, initiatives are 3 to 5 years in duration. Unless you're a startup and you're moving really fast, maybe your initiatives have a shorter time horizon, but don't confuse yourself with actions and initiatives. Remember, actions are the baby steps that you take in order to push your initiatives forward. They're not the same thing. For example, redoing your website is not an initiative. It's an action of a greater initiative. And maybe the initiative is to build your brand, right? And part of building your brand, that's a big 3 to 5 year activity, right? But the baby steps involved with doing that include redoing the website, or creating an app, or redoing your brand identity, whatever it may be, creating more content. All these different actions that you take push that initiative forward. So just don't get confused between actions and initiatives. That's really critical. But just remember that initiatives do four things. In some initiatives, they might cover all four areas, and that's when you know that it's a really good initiative. But probably the biggest mistake that I've made in the past when it comes to strategy is that early on, I'd create these strategies, I'd define the strategic problem, then I'd get excited about the initiatives, but then I realized later on that the initiatives weren't even connected to the strategic problem. That's why it's really important to ask yourself that first question, will this initiative help us to overcome our strategic problem? Just make sure that they're related, they're interconnected somehow. The last fundamental to understand is that strategy and finance, when combined together, they drive value. Now, there's two main value drivers as it pertains to finance and strategy. Number one, return on invested capital, and number two is growth. Now, return on invested capital is driven by two things, either price premiums or cost and capital efficiencies. So if you think about generic strategies, you could pursue a cost leadership strategy or a differentiation strategy or a focus strategy, which is a blend or combination thereof, right? If you go down the cost leadership approach, in other words, you pursue that generic strategy, well, ultimately, you're going to be improving your cost and capital efficiencies, right? That's going to improve your return on invested capital. If you go down the other path of a differentiation, you're going to improve return on invested capital through price premiums because you're going to enhance your customer experience, you're going to improve your brand, you're going to strengthen your perceived quality or whatever it may be. But those are the two main drivers of return on invested capital: price premiums and cost and capital efficiencies. In order to compute return on invested capital, you're taking net operating profit after tax and you're dividing it by your invested capital base, which is net PP&E plus your working capital. Combine those two together, that's your invested capital. Take net operating profit after tax, divide it by that, and you end up with return on invested capital. And then you look at growth, which is driven by introducing new products into the market, getting more market share, doing M&A, whatever it may be. But when you use these two drivers, return on invested capital and growth, and you combine those with your strategy, that's how you drive value. So just make sure that those things are connected. Otherwise, you have a strategy over here, you have finance over here, and they're not talking to each other, and it doesn't end up super well, and you don't have the impact that you could have if they are attached. All right. So there you have it. Those are the four fundamentals to understand. Number one, strategy and strategic planning are completely different. Remember, strategy is a set of interrelated choices you make related to where you're going to compete, how you're going to compete, and how you're going to win. Number two, take the time up front to clearly define your strategic problem because everything else trickles down from there. Number three, remember that initiatives do four things. They help you to overcome your strategic problem. They help you to enhance your customer experience. They help you to innovate and to build competitive advantages. So make sure your initiatives are touching on one of these four things. And lastly, remember the value drivers, return on invested capital and growth, and how your strategy combined with finance can drive tremendous firm value. So there you have it. See, strategy isn't that complicated. It doesn't have to be so abstract. If you could just stick to these four fundamentals and you can memorize these fundamentals and you can communicate them clearly to your team, then people are going to understand strategy so much better and they're actually going to be able to execute on it to drive value. There you have it. That's what I have for you. Just remember, if you ever need help along the way, you can always reach out. You can find me at coltivar.com. I'd be happy to hop on a strategy call with you to talk about your business. No pressure whatsoever. I'm just here to help in whatever way that I can. All right, all the best. Until next episode, cheers.